It's concerning because, again, if the bottom line is we're trying to help people understand themselves and help them function better and lead a more fulfilling life, you can't do that when you're only getting 10 or 20% of the story. I'm going to reframe my question, Phil. I have a couple of questions. They're related. So the first question is, when you talk about autoheterosexuality, or if we talk about autogynephilia or autoandrophilia, help explain to people why it's not just some excessive narcissistic self-love. Can you explain why it's not just that?
Yeah. Because even though it is like a love of a part of yourself, whether or not I think it's fair to call it narcissistic depends on whether the way people act on it damages their ability to interact with other people and form meaningful, healthy relationships. Even though the roots of self, auto and philia for love are in the labels for these orientations, I just don't think it is narcissism. Because anecdotally, I've met plenty of AGPs and AAPs, and I wouldn't say narcissism seems to be the norm among this group. The orientation may make them put extra emotional significance in that cross-gender part of themselves, but it just doesn't strike me as like a cluster B sort of personality disorder type thing. I guess I don't really have I don't really know a whole bunch about narcissism. It just doesn't seem like the same thing.
And it's interesting because as we're talking about this here, and it's somewhat tangential but related to the topic of love, I think that with love in general, we do have to love ourselves. We've spoken in our previous podcast about relationships that one of the most important things for anybody to do when it comes to love is ensure that they're feeling, happy and healthy with who they are. So I think that self-love is important in love in general.
That's some healthy self-regard. Yeah.
Right. So at least the second part of the question, which we do know that there are numerous stories of when someone realizes, and traditionally it's been the male to female, in this case, autogynephile, when they find out, you know what, I have this other part of myself and I need to be true to myself. And part of that involves, sadly, leaving a current partner, either because, oftentimes the partner doesn't find it compatible. They can't go along with it. They didn't sign up for this. The person said, I married a man, and I can't now suddenly become a lesbian or be a partner with a woman, or the person becomes so self-involved, so absorbed in their own journey, the person being the autogynephile, that they don't have time for the other person or family. They need to again become more complete. So a lot of people would say either that's selfish or it's narcissistic. You're not taking into consideration your partner or your child or children, right? So I'm going to let you elaborate or discuss what your thoughts are on that, about how to balance, one's need to become complete without breaking up other systems that the person has become involved in. And this might be part of your answer, but I will say that I lecture about this all the time because I have numerous patients who went through the exact same, let's say, trajectory, but it was about, being able to come to terms with being gay. And it was the same issue. Some families are able to, remain intact. Some are, break apart, unfortunately. Some people who are gay are all, they're bisexual, where they say, you know what, they find a workaround somehow, or the partner says, we'll open up the relationship, allow you, maintain your family, but also discover this other part of yourself, be this other part of yourself. So I don't know if the parallels fall apart in any way, if they're perfectly compatible, but do you want to just, what are your thoughts on, people, completing themselves?
Yeah, there definitely is some overlap where you mentioned between the same sex attracted people and the AGPs and the autogynephiles. There's overlap in that a lot of these people got into relationships denying this part of themselves or hoping it would go away, and not having access to good information about it, and then down the line they just build up this inner tension, this unmet need gnaws at them, and they say, you know what, I have to give in somewhat to this side of myself in order to be happy and to live true to myself. And and it's sad when that happens for the families, if it breaks up, marriages and families. It's sad, and that's part of why I want these orientations to be understood more, so that early on, people that have autoheterosexual orientations, if on their like first or second date with a person, I think they should let them know, hey, this is a big part of my sexuality. It is unlikely to change. If it is not, if that's something that is a deal breaker for you, then we should not pursue this. Like, I ideally would like to see a world where people understand their orientations before they make serious romantic commitments, so that they're doing it in full knowledge of themselves and their motivations, and so that their partners can also meaningfully consent to putting that energy into the relationship.
So, Phil, for me, it's in my nature as a therapist to want to know more about you and your experiences with this. So, was that something that you experienced where, perhaps in dating or in relationships, you had this moment of pause?
There, it wasn't something for a long time. I just tried to ignore it, so I didn't really put much thought into it. It was it. I have noticed though that it can make it so, after the honeymoon phase of the relationship is like sort of over, maybe like a year and a half into the relationship, it can be harder to want to maintain the relationship. And I don't know, I imagine that's normal to some extent, but I figure what I experience is probably a little more resistance than the normal person experiences, where, after some period of time, it's sort of that inner animal force, that magnetism that draws people together, like it's just not as strong in me, so there's a
Did you
feeling
have
of
to
like,
go
why am
through
I
that?
doing this?
Did you have to go through that a few times before you kind of had a light bulb moment of self-reflection?
It's only through learning about the orientation that I had any idea of what was going on. I would not have figured this out through introspection. There's just no
Okay.
way. If I didn't come across these important scientific concepts, I would have continued to be lost in that respect.
And do you think that's because you just didn't have that point of reference?
There's just no way I could have predicted that the reason, I haven't like had, say, like, some people have relationships that are like 5, 10, 15 years or whatever. I haven't had any that long yet. And,
Mm-hmm.
Learning about this scientific theory, it makes sense of why that is the case for me. But I wouldn't have figured it out just on my own. I don't even think if I went to a therapist, we would have like made up some false narrative because the therapist wouldn't have known about autogynephilia.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it definitely has an impact on my courtship life, so to speak.
Yeah. So now that you have a better understanding of it, is it a positive impact?
It would be way easier to be conventionally heterosexual. I have, just given my physique and such, I'm not really naturally well suited for being autogynephilic. But it can make things more complicated. But I've also still been able to, date people and have meaningful romantic relationships. And so it's not like my romantic life is ruined or anything by having the orientation. It's just like I have to adapt to it, and it's being a sexual minority comes with its own complications.
Mm-hmm.
With like, it shrinks your dating pool, but that really hasn't been too much of an issue so far.
And actually, that's interesting because that brings up another one of the many terms in the book. I want to make sure I get it right. Ambiheterosexuality. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Which is what you're describing, which would allow somebody to be autoheterosexual while also maintaining potentially, a relationship with someone else. So do you want to describe the ambiheterosexuality?
Yeah, I use that term ambiheterosexual to the ambi just means both allo and auto. It means you're attracted both to the other sex and to being the other sex in sort of somewhat similar proportions, such that it makes sense to use that term. And when you're in that sort, like I have it to that degree, where the two different, the allo and the auto sides, there's this, what each side wants is different. And so there's a tension between the two. And it's like, how do you make it work such that both sides are satisfied adequately? And it's this sort of pendulum. It goes back and forth, and it's really hard to know what to do. And it's hard to feel like there's a clear answer too, because if I was just like 100% autogynephilic, the decision to like transition would be a no-brainer, in the sense of, oh, there's like 0% of my sexuality that cares about anything else, therefore it's a no-brainer to transition. But when you have both the allo and auto attractions to similar degrees, there's this tension between them that it leads to a lot of complication, and there's not really a clear way of satisfying both sides at the same time, because a lot of the things they want are contradictory.
Mm-hmm.
And what are some of those things?
Well, like for instance, my regular heterosexuality, I'd want to be with, what like a conventionally feminine woman. But the autoheterosexuality, it increases the attractiveness of women that are masculine in physique or in their personality traits, and so it makes masculine women more attractive. And so basically, yeah, there's this, the two different sides want different things. And like that example of like what type of partner you'd be into is just one example. In terms of like the methods of like sexual intercourse or whatever, it makes sense that if like one side would want to say do like penetrative penis and vagina sex, whereas like the other side would want to be penetrated, so it's the two different sides, they want to play like both roles at the same, like you kind of want both things at the same time, and it's not really possible. And so it's really hard to figure out.
Do you think that would be dependent on the partner that you're paired up with at the time? Like would a certain type of partner highlight one of those sides more than another?
Yeah, I mean it would depend on the partner. I would say for someone who's it's good that we brought up this subject, because I think the ratio of strength between the allo and the auto sides I think it's a very big determinant of the ultimate trajectory a person takes as to whether or not over the long term they will transition, and if so, to what degree. And so it's just such a big determinant, because if you're mostly just care about being a woman, then you'll pick sexual partners that fit that. And I have found personally that it's possible to find people that sort of suit both your sides to some extent, and so that like as a composite sort of form of attraction, they're attractive and it works. Like a woman that's like has a little bit of masculinity, for instance, that's like somewhat bisexual. There's compatibility with that sort of person.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I brought in earlier a few, let's say, intersecting, overlapping, coincidental maybe issues, because they do overlap. They do intersect in many ways that we're not fully aware of. And if I can just bring one example, and you kind of alluded to it, and you say this in your book as well, you talk about how, for someone who's auto-heterosexual, they are going to be more attracted to a partner of a sex that makes them feel more in line with who they want to be. So if you're a biological male, you're autogynephilic, you want a woman who's more masculine because that makes you feel more or look, more feminine in comparison to them. Right. And some people will take offense to that, saying, well, why are you using the terms masculine and feminine? Well, this is the language convention. We're talking dominant or masculine looking, feminine, submissive, whatever, softer, however you want to frame it. If it's being discussed with no judgment, we're just talking about people's preferences. We're talking about what turns them on, what is compatible with their needs, and so on. There's no hatred involved. There's no bias. There's no sexism. It's just describing people's interests and attractions and so on. So I think it's really important for people to recognize that these are not neat, tidy, little packets. There's a lot of mess going on. They do intersect in certain ways, and we don't fully understand it. And what I was going to say was, and I know Blanchard and Bailey talk about this a lot, and maybe you can talk about it, Phil, this idea that, again, traditionally, when they talked about the autogynephile versus the homosexual, transsexual, okay, the big distinction was, who are they sexually attracted to? And then so a lot of people who deny being autogynephilic say, wait, but I'm also attracted to women. To men. I am attracted to men. So I am either bisexual, or I'm what you call homosexual, transsexual. I'm not autogynephilic because I like women. And what people have stated, including Lawrence, Dr. Lawrence as well, is the fact that, is it really let's say a biological innate attraction to the same sex? Or is it more a role? Is it more the narrative? Is it that the greatest, let's say, obvious representation of my being a female, at least sexually speaking, I want to be clear, we're talking sexually speaking, would be to be penetrated by a man. Metaphorically, visually speaking, and physically speaking, that's the greatest representation. So does that mean that they are sexually attracted to men, or is it to the idea that having a man with me, penetrating me, validates my role, my need to be seen as and to feel as a woman. Thoughts on that?
Right. I do think that, yeah, what you're describing here, the meta attraction, it is,
Right.
I think it makes it so it can be sometimes hard to tell what ideology someone is just based on their partner preferences, where
Right.
there are some transsexuals that you'd categorize as homosexual just based on their partner preferences, but their homosexuality is a byproduct of meta attraction rather than conventional homosexuality. And so it can be hard to tell which of the two groups a transsexual falls into sometimes. And so I think this ultimately leads to us underestimating the true prevalence of the autosexual contingent of the trans people, because some of the homosexual group is actually not the homosexual type, so to speak. And yeah, as you said, it's with meta attraction, it seems to be more about the attraction to a particular type of embodiment and how that partner makes you feel, rather than the conventional direct attraction to their physical features that we think of with conventional sexual orientation. And I'll say that someone who is strongly autoheterosexual to the degree that they barely have any conventional allosexual attraction, from the inside, they wouldn't have anything to compare it to. They would just be going with what their strongest attraction is, and that would be to having this sort of same sex interactions, but in a cross gender sex role. And so this can lead to this is some of the issue that some transsexuals have with the typology, is that it doesn't cleanly like separate between the two groups all the time based on that sorting with the homosexual non-homosexual sorting. And and they don't like how the meta attraction thing can almost emotionally feel as if it's like not genuine attraction, so it's being devalued in some way.
Right. And again, this is why I kind of like this idea. And I know some of the people, like I said earlier, are not going to appreciate hearing this because, I don't fit into any mold. I fit into what is reality, what is going to help the most number of people or the greatest number of people, what is going to be, showing compassion to all sides of the issue. And so they may not like to hear this, but as I said several times now, and by the way, Phil, every episode, there's always a drinking game we play that I repeat the same term over and over. So here we go. Paradigm shift. Okay. I really like this idea. Okay, Phil's going to join in, right? Paradigm shift. So, okay. Mm-hmm. I really like, thanks, Malini. Yeah, I really like this idea of trying to, again, destigmatize people's experiences, assuming that they're not harming somebody, assuming that they're not doing something that we would all universally agree is reprehensible, assuming that they are trying to live a quote unquote normal life, to have the same rights afforded to them, the same well-being, etc. Right? If we shift it to, again, as a sexuality. So, for example, when people go online and when they're doing the like Hinge or Tinder or anything like that, they have all these designations, and they can say, for example, I'm pansexual, demisexual, asexual, and there's it's ever growing. If autoheterosexual were one of the categories, it would be easier, as say, upfront to find people who say, yeah, either like-minded people or someone who's more sympathetic to it, or it's just compatible with what they're looking for. They might actually be pansexual and saying, like, I really don't care about the the physical side of you, it's who you are, and so on. It would just make it easier, I believe, to help people who are autoheterosexual find love in a way that works for all parties involved. So that's my, it's not a question, it's putting out there. I'm hoping, again, that this paradigm shift, helps lead to, again, less stigma and more ability to, to live freely and independent, and have fulfillment.
Yeah. And I really hope it helps too. Cause my goal is, like, a long-term goal is to get this taught in sex ed, at the same age that kids learn about homosexuality or bisexuality. I think you could also teach them about autoheterosexuality, at an age appropriate level, whatever that is for their age. Right. And I think this would go a long way towards helping kids that experience gender dysphoria understand their situation and start contemplating, hey, what is the best way of dealing with this? Because right now they get taught this sort of gender religion in school that doesn't really make any sense. And so the information they're being taught right now is not helping them actually prepare for the transition decision about whether to do it or not to do it, you know. And I'm hoping that if this is incorporated in early education or in sex education, that, you know, when kids hit puberty and then they start wondering, like, why am I having these feelings? They won't be privately confused and feeling ashamed. They'll just be like, oh, I'm this thing that they taught about in school and it's a fine thing to be. You know, I think it would really streamline the decision making process. Because yeah, I know I do have some worries about the child youth gender transition happening now, and part of it is just with the information that kids get, it's not very good. Same with the clinicians too.
Well, yeah, and Malini and I were talking about this before we came on about, you know, as clinicians. But Malini, I'll let, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'll let you talk about that. But afterwards, I do want to bring up something that Phil does mention in the book that I think is so important for people to understand. You know, let's say how to help people with these feelings. So before I say that, again, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Malini, do you want to talk about like
Sure, yeah.
side?
Yeah. So earlier today, Oren and I were just chatting about how in reading your book, it really opened my eyes to a statement that you made, and it really resonated with me that the clinicians who are charged with the task of helping such individuals have such little information and such poor information about how to handle these situations properly. And of course, Oren, I think, have a more robust understanding of the topic than the average clinician. And I'm still readily admitting that I don't think I know enough.
When I was looking into the sort of the medical clinical situation, I kind of got more and more appalled at how people, only the gender affirming model is allowed in a lot of places, and the clinicians don't even know that they're supposedly treating two fundamentally different conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Like that seems like absolutely basic, like even like pre 101 level knowledge, and
it is.
And the clinicians, they don't know, and they're also the ones that do know are likely in a spot where they can't even necessarily tell the patient, hey, you're autogynephilic, without risking their licensing or getting a complaint, things like that.
Yeah. And 100%. And, you know, it's a little bit different here than in the US, but generally speaking, we feel quite a bit like our hands are tied, right? We're damned if we do, we damned if we don't, because there's such a threat against our licensing if we say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing.
Right.
Right. And like, I feel like that's just going to incentivize clinicians to stay out of trying to help that subset of patients. If they're more trouble than it's worth, you know?
Well, that's
and
exactly
how sad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Again, we commit ourselves to a profession where we're trying to help. And so many people now, especially in Canada, Bill C4, where it criminalizes, you know, conversion therapy, a loosely defined term. So if someone, you know, does try to explore, and the bill supposedly takes that into account. I said this in a previous episode, even though the language is such that if you're just exploring without any bias, it shouldn't count as conversion therapy. But imagine a patient comes to the call, makes a complaint to the college saying, I came in for my gender issues and my clinician was saying I have a kink. I'm just some pervert or something, right? That they can just twist it around, and and that would show bias supposedly, and that they would distort it so much that instead of saying, okay, you may have a paraphilia or a autoheterosexuality, if we use the new paradigm shift language, right? Instead of saying that and let's explore it, it will be turned around against the clinician, and it doesn't serve anybody, right? So this leads to my next point I was going to say, and Phil, you talk about it in the book. I think it's really important, and it's now where I'm converging a few points I mentioned earlier, which is, I've said this in a previous podcast, and it's only anecdotal. And again, Phil, you talk about it in the book, where I say that the autogynephiles that I know who accept that they have autogynephilia, they seem to be doing so much better. Yes, they have gender dysphoria. Yes, they're on a trajectory or a path trying to, become something that they either, we hope they can become, or will not be able to fully. Okay. But the fact is, they seem to have so much general mental health, or so much better general mental health outside of the dysphoria than those who presumably deny it. Okay. And then you talk about why this is, about the objects. We talked earlier about objects of sexual attraction. And then B, why for women or for younger girls, why this will be more difficult because of, females and paraphilias, or this type of erotic target location error, quote unquote, or erotic target inversion, Can you talk about that? Again, this idea of how to help cope with autoheterosexuality and the difference between males and females?
Yeah, I think with regards to why I think AGPs that accept it seem to do better is the alternative narrative they have is that you are trans and the only way you can be happy is if you transition. And so what that does is it creates an unrealistic expectation of what their appearance will look like. Like if an AGP male gets told that, hey, you're just actually a woman, and then if they take that to heart and then they'll start comparing their appearance to their idea of what a woman should look like, and then the disparity there brings suffering because they they don't have the looks they wish they had. Whereas if they think of it as I'm a sexual minority that is attracted to being a woman, it doesn't imply any level of embodiment. Like you can't fail at having a sexual orientation, you just have it. And so
right.
Whereas like with gender transition, there there's like accomplishments and failures, so to speak. But if you just think of it in terms of an orientation, I think it hurts less to just face reality head on. You get over the initial, like the icky feelings at first when you're like, oh, I have a weird type of sexuality. And then you just I think once people accept it, it's a lot easier.
I think that statement requires repetition. You can't fail at having a sexual orientation. I love that.
Right. Like, whereas transition, you can fail at it. Like, in terms of, at least if your goal is passing, it's, that's not always possible. And when you try to pass, you always have to be monitoring yourself. Am I behaving the right way? Am I there's just such intense self-scrutiny to adhere to the cross-gender persona. Whereas if you're just recognize that you have this orientation and it makes you like doing this cross-gender stuff, and if you sort of like try not to get too attached to the outcome of whether you succeed at it, I think it's a lot easier to weather the dissatisfactions that can come along with it.
Okay, and to that point then, because again, this is the distinction between males and females and how biological males and females, how they can sort of cope with, let's say not a full transition, but the autoheterosexuality and why women may have a harder time dealing with that. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Right. Yeah, like, and so male sexual orientation seems much more visual, right? And so I think, as far as I can tell, autogynephiles compared to autoandrophiles, the autogynephiles seem to care more about the anatomy and the clothing. They care more about just looking the part. There's quite a few of them that transition just medically and not socially at all, just because they care that little about the social aspect. Whereas it seems that females care much more about the social aspect and about that their orientations there's a much stronger relational component to it of, when they're thinking of dating a guy, it's not as simple as like, wow, he's hot. It's more like, what kind of guy is he? Is he funny? Does he like maintain good relationships with his family? Is he reliable? There's like this whole, for evolutionary reasons, there's this whole extra lot more mental calculations that are going on and sort of like greater depth of decision making. And so as far as I can tell, autoandrophiles seem to care more about the interpersonal aspect of cross-gender embodiment, about others seeing them as a man, or at least not being seen as a woman. Just they care more about how they're seen by others. And that's something that it's hard to it's hard to embody that, if you don't do the medical stuff to get the deep voice and everything. Most autoandrophiles aren't going to be able to suitably embody it such that other people treat them differently. And so, yeah, it seems like the aspect of the orientation that they put more emphasis in, the interpersonal aspect, it's harder to achieve, and it takes more serious investment in terms of medicalization. And I think this greater interpersonal aspect also makes sense of the fact that most people that identify as non-binary are female. Like roughly 4 out of 5. When kids are I've just seen a lot of anecdotes and stuff that when kids are transitioning in schools, it seems to be overwhelmingly female dominant. That they do it. It's all it spreads socially, but also it seems that the females care more about the pronouns, put greater stock in them, whereas the males care more about how do I look.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, there's certainly enough. There are, but for some. We're talking in general. I just want to be clear here.
Right.
Malini and I've talked about before in our podcast. Anytime we say any statement, someone says, "Well, that's not me," or yes, we're talking in general. Okay. And as I was saying earlier about like with paraphilias, whatever we want to call it, as you're saying, when it comes to that, the male cares more about how how they look when they're trying to explore or enjoy their sexuality, right? You say in the book as well that so a male can just do some cross dressing, right? Even if it's private or even if it's, let's say, under the clothes, they can act on that aspect of it and get some satisfaction that a female wouldn't, because that's not what it's about. As you say, for a female, she wants to be accepted socially, interpersonally as this male, and without medical or hormonal surgical transitioning, it's harder to accomplish, right? So, as you say, like they find different ways to sort of try to accomplish that, like being gender queer, being non-binary, and so on. It's kind of, again, it's a social part and it's a compromise, but it doesn't necessarily seem, I think, for some people as satisfying as the actual, again, as doing more along the sexual side, right? I'm just trying to say once again that it's not just one thing or the other. There is there's the sex part, the sexuality part, the interpersonal part, the gender part, the social part. There's so many different factors, and different people for different people, certain elements are going to be more prominent. Certain elements are going to be more triggering. Certain elements are going to be something that they're trying to achieve more than others. And once again, getting back to something I said, or we said earlier, which is if we don't take into account that any person coming into a clinic, any person coming to a doctor trying to get help could be dealing with, A, B, and C, or D, E, F, or A and F, or whatever. If we don't take all of that into account, we are going to be misleading many people. We're not going to be treating the underlying, issues and needs, and we're going to cause more harm than good. But once again, the fact is we're not allowed to discuss all of these. We're supposed to just go with the narrative, gender affirming, whatever they say. Don't ask questions, just affirm them. And we may once again be leading people down the wrong path, whether they are just gender non-conforming, that's simple, or they have autoheterosexuality, but it's not being dealt with in the way that works best for them. And again, you're not allowed to talk about it. And of course, the critics of us, will say, "Oh no. WPATH states clearly collaboration. It's lots of assessment, lots of ongoing evaluation, lots of therapy, et cetera, et cetera." Well, that would be great. A, if that were the case, which oftentimes it's not, and B, if the people doing all of that, again, understand these things. If you're doing all this evaluation and therapy and so on, but they're not recognizing that there are a whole host of factors going on here. It's not just simply, quote unquote, simple male born in a female body or something like that, right? There's much more to it. And part of it is the sexual orientation, sexual attraction, sexuality part. And we can't deny that. That is a part. It's part of who we are. So again, if we take this very neutral approach, as you say, you can't do sexual orientation wrong, or you can't get it wrong, right? Mm-hmm. If we take that non-judgmental, open stance, I think we have a much greater chance of helping people, progress through what they're, through whatever they're going through. So that's just my soap. Yeah. I'll get up my soapbox now.
I've made the analogy before with this as far as ADHD, right? You can go to a general practitioner, they go through the checklist and here's your ADHD diagnosis, but we know through our work that there's so much more complexity to it and so many more layers to it. And it, to treat any gender issue different than the way we're supposed to treat anything in our profession is just ludicrous.
Right. Yeah, it's got to be very annoying as a clinician to be told that, like, hey, your role has traditionally been gatekeeping and using your clinical judgment, but actually you can't do that. All you can do is affirm. And then I can imagine there might be the feeling of like, what is my purpose here? How am I even providing a benefit if my hands are tied?
Yeah.
Oh no, my hands are not tied. They're free to rubber stamp. Okay. You say something? That's what I get to do. Rubber stamp. Even if I know it's not in the person's best interest. So yes, exactly. And yeah, it's concerning because again, if the bottom line is we're trying to help people understand themselves and help them function better and lead a more fulfilling life, you can't do that when you're only getting 10 or 20% of the story, or you can only discuss that amount. So once again, I hate to keep saying it over and over. And by the way, there's a reason, Phil, that you are the very first guest. Malini and I have always just had, the two of us talking. But when this book came out, we both agreed, especially with the timing with our own series on these issues, that we thought it was just, again, such a helpful resource. It just, again, it's written in such a plain common, simple language with such complex issues, and it's all so well researched. I can't see how somebody would not want to read it. Just learn more about these things, especially if they've already engaged in the gender wars. Why not add this to your to your knowledge base?
Right. And yeah, thank you for saying all the nice things about the book, both of you. Yeah.
Of course.
It,
So, Phil, I have a question for you. So, is there any advice or recommendation or resource or something that you wish you had as you went through your journey of exploration of yourself and your sexuality that you could maybe impart onto listeners who are wondering about themselves? Or what are your thoughts on that?
I just wish I understood the psychology earlier instead of trying to just introspect or use trial and error, or just realistically just try to avoid thinking about it because it conflicted with my male ego. I just wish I had that it had been explained to me accurately and coherently and like very clearly. Basically, I wish that I had access to the book that I wrote to like that's why I wrote it, so that people that were in my circumstance would be able to just get told straight up, here's what you are, here's how it works. There's no one right way of dealing with it, but if you understand the orientation and yourself, you're going to be more likely to make the decisions that are right for you. Like,
I think that statement can be made about sexuality and identity in general, right? The more we know about ourselves and understand ourselves, the better off we're going to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Sexual research is very important.
Right. And that's the problem, that it's so personal, it's so taboo even today. Of all the words you can use, and I've been teaching human sexuality, over about 20 years. I say to students, over those 20 years, still today, I can talk about all these different subjects, but one word that still makes people get a bit shaky: masturbation, for example. Even something as natural as ubiquitous as masturbation still makes people feel icky, right? Just that word. So when we're talking about these complex issues, all right, like people, they naturally, they kind of back away. And if we're talking about young children and sexuality, even that, and we're not talking about inappropriate sexuality, we're talking, we know children, teens, preteens, that's part of the development. That's how we grow up. We start to have sexual feelings, whether it's romantic, whether it's physiological, whether it's emotional, interpersonal, whatever it is. And as you say, there are many sexual minorities. If we add up all the different types of sexual minorities, it's more than a handful. There are quite a few. And so we do need the research, again, unbiased, as objective as possible, not discriminatory, just trying to find information to help explain, to help validate. And just a little side note here, it was a couple of years ago, I think it was last year or 2 years ago, that Bailey and I want to say Sue, HSU, his former student, they did the meta-analysis on the existing research on bisexuality, the physiological research using the penile strain gauges and the plethysmographs, the photocell plethysmographs. And I don't know if either of you know, do you know how many studies were involved in their meta-analysis on all existing literature on the subject? Again, we're talking about physiological arousal of bisexuals.
Oh, was it 4? Just guessing.
I was going to say 2.
Okay, you guys killed it. It's funny. Take the 2 to multiply 8. Okay, when you underguess, now it makes because to me 8 is a pathetically low number.
It is.
You guys went down to 2. Now it makes
my guess came from the fact that I assumed it was pathetically low.
Okay, so right, so by synchronicity, 2 times 4 is 8. It's 8, right? And so the reason I'm bringing this up is there's a dearth of information in that regard. Again, that's just one other area. It's a sexuality. It's another sexual orientation. And B, so many people, instead of saying, well, thank you for showing that we're not just fantasizing, we're not just afraid to come out fully out of the closet, we're not just trying to double our chance of getting laid on a weekend, right? Thank you for saying this is a real construct, it's a real experience, it's a real sexuality. Some people said that, but many others said, how dare you even think about studying us? Because there is a history of the eggheads, of the people in the white coats studying sexual minorities or racial minorities or any other type of minority in a very insulting, non-human type of way. You are a subject, right? As opposed to a human being. So I get it. I understand that there's a sad history, an ugly history of how psychologists, psychiatrists, and academics and researchers have dealt with these issues. But the fact is, the more good research, comprehensive research we have, the better understanding we have of it, and most importantly, as you were saying, Phil, that for younger people, when they, if they have more resources where they can say, "Oh, this helps explain what I am going through," and I agree with you. I hope that we can introduce this into at an age appropriate level into the right streams so that people can learn more about it. Once again, I want to be very clear: age appropriate.
Right. It doesn't have to be
right.
graphic. It can be very simple.
Exactly. No, exactly. So the more that we can talk about it, the more that we can, I think, help a larger number of people. And there's a lot of collateral damage in these gender wars. So many people are being harmed, not just people, who may be transgender, but very many other people in many different ways are being harmed. And, that's what Malini and I've been trying to do in our podcast, is say, how do we address these complex, controversial, and equivocal issues in a fair, balanced, and comprehensive manner that takes into account all people's needs, or as many people's needs as possible. So, like I said,
and to your point, yeah, like the divisiveness comes from, I think, a lack of willingness to accept the complexity of these topics.
Right. The complexity, and when those complexities involve things that people, again, don't like to hear. Ooh,
Yeah.
sexuality, or, it's just, again, I think when we have credible people with science behind them, not just anecdotes and so on, I do think that it does help in the end. So again, I think that's the last positive thing I'll say about the book, Phil. Okay, just because I don't want to keep milking it. But I was so impressed when I read it, and I really thought this is the book. 10 years ago, I wouldn't have said this is the book society needs. Okay, maybe 15 years ago, I wouldn't have said that. Okay, in the last 10-ish years or so, I would say it's the book that we need, because so many people are chiming in, and so many people don't have the requisite knowledge to be able to chime in. Yet that doesn't stop them.
Right, exactly. Everyone's chiming in, but few can even just tell you that there's two different types of trans, like absolutely basic stuff.
Exactly.
That said, Phil, so let's say 10 years from now, look into your crystal ball. What do you hope you will have accomplished with this book?
Well, I would like if the gender wars, as as Oren put it, if the gender wars could simmer down a little bit, because instead of people just fighting over their weakly informed opinions, if they instead understood the phenomenon, I think they'd be more reasonable. And so, yeah, I hope to make the gender wars kind of simmer down or come to a conclusion. And I don't think it will come to a full conclusion. The battle between the TERFs or radfems or whatever you want to call them, and the AGPs, that I think that conflict will endure, but I hope that it gets to be less intense than it has been. Yeah, and I hope that what I want is just that when you have some pubescent kid that's experiencing these feelings about being attracted or aroused by being the other sex, that they could know very quickly, oh, this is what's happening, and spare themselves years of needless introspection about, like, am I trans or not, and instead realize, hey, I have this orientation, what do I want to do about it? I think that'll speed up the decision-making process. And, the trans activists talk all the time about how they would have been happier if they could transition earlier. And I think a very practical way of doing that would also hopefully reduce harm is just having the kids understand as early as possible what their actual situation is, so that, to the extent that they can make decisions, that they're making better ones.
Yeah, and I gotta say, Phil, one of my favorite things to do, and I know Oren knows this about me, is talk about things that I don't know a whole lot about. So I'm really, really enjoying this conversation, this discussion. You've given me tons to think about and different ways to look at it. So I really, really appreciate this conversation.
Yep, as do I. And again, I'm not going to heap praise anymore. Already done it. Okay. But really, thank you for coming on, Phil. I'm so glad that we got a chance to speak with you. And, we're trying to put a face behind the book, behind potential paradigm shift. 1 second, last time. Okay. And again, just trying, it's the same thing, Malini, I've said every single episode, trying to help people get along better. And the way you get along better is to understand each other better. And I think this really goes a long way to helping people understand others. It's not an insignificant number of people. It may, whatever the number is, it's maybe an underestimate, as we're discovering.
Mm-hmm.
And also, again, many people, we've talked before, who think they might have one issue or condition or experience or identity, whatever. Maybe they have something else. Maybe they look similar, but to understand them differently will have a huge impact on their sense of self, their well-being, and whatever path they take forward to, again, try to lead a satisfying, enriched, fulfilling life. So I think you've really contributed to that, Phil. And with that, I'm just going to wrap this up and say, until next time, keep your eyes on the road and your hands upon the wheel.
As much as we love listening to ourselves speak, especially me, we would love to hear from you as well. So our emails are in the description below. If you would please write to us with your questions, feedback, comments, topics that you would like us to cover. We can do this together, the two of us, but it's much better if we do it together. So we look forward to hearing from you, and we are going to have a segment called Rounds Table, where we're going to discuss the feedback and the questions and so on from our audience, and we will take it to the next level. We're going to help you be able to deal with some of these issues that you might be bringing us, or it's going to be a topic for us to explore together. And we really look forward to building a community of like-minded people who want to do right by others, not just for themselves.